At 2100 on the evening of June 11th, the crew was called to stations, and the ship lifted anchor and left Portsmouth. At 02:15 the next morning, they made a rendezvous with two British cable ships already under the escort of HMS Dianthus and an anti-submarine trawler, the HMS Hugh Walpole, off the Needles of the Isle of Wight. The monotony of the mission, which consisted of circling the slowest vessels at close range, was broken by the sight of planes in the sky and a falling bomb. The planes were German Focke-Wulf FW-190 aircraft, but they were quickly chased from the area when 12 Spitfires came roaring across the sky. As darkness fell and the two ships made their way at a snail's pace, laying cable on the bottom, tracer fire and explosions could be seen on the horizon. There was traffic all about them as ships passed back and forth across the channel. As they approached the coast of France, the possibility of a shore battery assault also loomed. Tensions were high. Unknown to the crew of Monarch and Trentonian, two American destroyers were patrolling not far from their location. The Americans had picked up the two ships on their radar and assumed they were friendly contacts. The commanding officer, W. Outterson, piloting the USS Plunkett, ordered star shells to be fired over the contacts at 02:30, but the shell failed to work properly due to such close range. As the distance continued dwindling between the two groups, Plunkett made another attempt to contact the vessels, flashing a message across the darkness. Plunkett repeated their signal 3 times, 10 seconds apart. No response was received. Plunkett opened fire at 3,000 yards. Trentonian was on the port side of Monarch. Firing commenced on a bearing of 160 degrees. No gun flashes were seen. Shells were heard close by, passing between the ships and over Trentonian.
I immediately ordered the men to stations. Arm the guns, but do not fire! I realized quickly this was friendly fire from the American destroyers. Thank God their initial barrage missed us. One shell passed directly between the funnel and the pom-pom gun platform.
Recognition lights were ordered to be flashed on and off, at which point fire then seemed to be redirected to Monarch. These shells didn't miss, and the sound was deafening as the ship was hammered by the American vessel. Harrison ordered Trentonian turned to broadside to present a silhouette of the ship that the Americans might recognize. Fire once again turned to Trentonian, and once again the shells missed her completely. The range was now only 1,000 yards.
Harrison was livid. He couldn't believe what was happening. He gave orders to maintain a broadside position and then came down and stormed the deck. I leaned over the railing and I cannot forget the sight of the lieutenant shaking his fist and yelling out, "Damn poor gunnery for such a close range!"
The signalman was sending a message in Morse code to the American vessel, and radio operators were frantically trying to communicate with the destroyer, while all the lights of Trentonian were ordered turned on and left on. As soon as the lights were observed by Plunkett, the barrage stopped. It is estimated that Plunkett fired approximately 80 rounds of 5-inch ammunition at the two vessels, with Monarch taking the brunt of the attack. Rescue attempts commenced immediately, with Monarch's whaler coming alongside with wounded, where it eventually sunk from its own damage. Meanwhile, Trentonian's whaler was dispatched to pick up remaining injured and return them to Trentonian. A number of crew on deck had been killed by the attack, as well as the first mate. At 03:35, the American destroyer sent a boat to Trentonian. While the crew were refused entry, a young ensign had asked to speak to Lieutenant Harrison and was brought aboard.
Harrison didn't even speak. He just stood there boiling in rage and let Lieutenant Kingsman ask the questions. This young officer in Plunkett told us his commander thought we were a German E-boat. Trentonian is twice the size of an E-boat, and the cable layer is even bigger. Harrison made no motion. He just stood there with silent rage. When the ensign left, he finally let loose. calling the Americans trigger happy, asking for a court-martial. I've never seen them like that before. Never would again.
The casualties were numerous. One man was sent to Plunkett for more serious care. And some of our crew were commissioned to help me out in the sick bay. There were just too many people to take care of. The doctor was also sent to the Monarch from the American group.
It didn't take long for the crew to realize the Americans were responsible for the assault, and some had to be physically restrained from boarding the Plunkett's whaler to teach them a lesson. Meanwhile, the damage to Monarch was extensive. The ship had to be steered manually as the bridge had been almost completely swept away by the assault. By 0724, Plunkett's doctor had treated 10 men who were now aboard Trentonian. One of these was Captain Troops of the Monarch, who had suffered a severe head injury, was unconscious, and not expected to survive. Some of the crew of Trentonian hadn't realized they were under attack. Some men off duty had even slept through the barrage. They had gotten quite used to the sound of heavy armaments firing. By 2200, all the wounded had been removed from the ship, and Trentonian anchored in a remote section of Portsmouth Harbour. Several dignitaries came on board and informed the remaining crew that not a word of the incident should ever be discussed with anyone. It was to remain completely secret. The crew was once again confined to the ship while resupplies were brought aboard. A new member also joined the crew, Sergeant Lieutenant G.P. West, Royal Navy Reserve, would be Trentonian's very own doctor.
I must say, I was very relieved when West came aboard. I had training in running the sick bay, of course, but I was no doctor. Many of the injuries sustained in the Plunkett attack had been beyond my help, and the American doctors were more than capable. Having West aboard would ensure that if another serious incident occurred, we could handle our own casualties.
On June 15th, orders were received to meet a convoy at Selsey. But first they tied up alongside the tanker ship SS Teakwood for refueling. Crew passed a 6-inch hose across the gap, which carried the fuel into the corvette. It was a thick fluid, so it was heated to help it flow between the vessels. Only a handful of crew was on deck, including the little dog A.B. O'Brien in his usual place on the bridge. While the fuel was being transferred to Trentonian, a pair of American destroyers came churning into the area at speed. A wake rolled across the water and began to toss Trentonian around. The fuel tanker was far too big and heavy to be affected. As the waves rocked the corvette, the fuel line burst, and a plume of hot bunker fuel sprayed across the deck of Trentonian, covering the Asdic hut and upper works as far back as the funnel. The men tried to make for cover, but were completely soaked in the heavy oil. Not even little A.B. O'Brien escaped the oily spray, and needed multiple washings. Signalman Jack Harold said that the remnants of the fluid were on his skin for days. While the deck and rails and ladders were hurriedly cleaned, the crew, who hadn't failed to notice what flags the destroyers were flying, once again cursed the Americans.
We had made across the Atlantic, made countless crossings of the Channel, been part of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, and escorted hundreds of ships in the process. And during that whole time, the only threat we ever faced, the only trouble we really had, was the Americans. Boy, we were ticked off.
Trentonian arrived at Selsey by 2047, and by 2210 the convoy was formed and began steaming for France. It consisted of large concrete blocks of various sizes, code-named Phoenixes, being towed by tugs. The idea was to sink these blocks to begin the construction of artificial harbours off the invasion area, which would allow for faster resupply and transport of munitions and goods to the battlefront. The plan was relatively simple, if difficult to achieve. A port was absolutely necessary, but Allied command had decided to avoid the costly and difficult challenge of taking an occupied port. They would be heavily defended, and any attack would very likely damage the facilities anyway. So the invasion force was to do, in the blink of an eye, what it would otherwise take years to accomplish. They would construct 2 ports the size of the port of Dover in just 3 days. All of the pieces used to construct these ports were prefabricated in England, sunk in harbours to hide them, then refloated in preparation to be towed across the channel. These pop-up harbours were designed to be built in stages, with the breakwaters having been deposited at the 5 beachheads on June 7th. That was all part of Trentonian's duty in Normandy when she arrived with the corn-cob convoys. These breakwaters were then reinforced with the massive concrete caissons code-named Phoenixes. Bombardons were 200 feet long floating breakwaters made of steel, towed across the channel, and combined with floating pontoons called spud pierheads, which were 200 feet long and 60 feet wide. These had retractable legs that would be anchored in the seafloor. Everything was secured to the bottom using newly designed kite anchors, with long floating bridge sections called whales spanning the sea from the platform to shore. This way ships could unload supplies directly onto the floating pier, and they could be brought to land quickly, which would limit the chance of attack from air or sea. After delivering their 3rd charge to the coast of Normandy, Harrison received orders to Portsmouth to take on fuel, and they arrived back to the English harbour just after 2000, where the crew was ordered to stand down.
During the stand down, Lieutenant West had time for a complete survey of the sick bay and her stock. As he remarked about how well organized it was, I did see him glance toward the back where my dark room line was strung, but he didn't ask me to take it down. Lieutenant West ordered medicines, instruments for minor surgery, and assorted other supplies, so we were equipped for more advanced medical procedures than I could have ever provided. It was reassuring to have his expertise.
Over the course of the next few days, Trentonian made more escort trips, one to a staging point off the English coast, and one to take mulberries to the French coast. It was on the way back to France that Trentonian lost her first crew member. Able Seaman O'Brien's health had been deteriorating since the fuel spill. He had been losing weight and started experiencing seizures. Early in the morning of June 24th, the little dog suffered a massive seizure and died shortly thereafter. The crew was hit hard by the passing of the little dog. Since joining the ship upon their first arrival in British waters, he had been a spunky source of great joy and happiness. The men gathered together on deck. O'Brien's little body had been wrapped and sewn into the hammock he had slept in. Arthur Slater, his handler, carried the tiny bundle to the railing, and O'Brien was buried at sea.
A lot of us had dogs, and O'Brien had become as good a friend to us as our own pups were back home. A lot of men came up on deck to say goodbye. It was a terribly sad moment.
The men had I hesitate to say, a service, a goodbye for the dog O'Brien. I attended, of course, and alongside them. Strange things happen to men at war, but in my mind, treating the dog like a member of the crew and then giving it a proper send-off, that's understandable. He was a member of our crew.
By June 27th, Trentonian was back in Portsmouth Harbour, having made another trip to the French coast. It was announced with great joy that shore leave was to commence in 2 rounds, their first since May 22nd. 2 men were returned in handcuffs charged with disorderly conduct after having tried to borrow a trolley, and 2 officers fell off the gangway and into the sea, having had 1 too many drinks to board safely. The following morning, Harrison dismissed the charges against the ratings, chalking it up to youthful exuberance and too much fun after a long period of continuous work. Harrison also received new orders that morning, and Trentonian sailed for Dungeness, near the Thames estuary, at 13:38. Operations at Portsmouth were now concluded, and Trentonian's new base of operations would be in Sheerness. This put the ship and her crew in the heart of what was the most dangerous place in the world for ships at the time, the Straits of Dover.
As we entered the strait for the first time, a German V-1 bomb went screaming by overhead. I remember Jack Harold grabbing his binoculars as the thing came barreling out of the cloud cover, and he exclaimed that it was a rocket propelled. None of us believed him at the time. When we heard later that they were indeed rockets, he dishes out a few more "I told you so's." 2 Spitfires shot it out of the sky. It hit the ocean, exploded like thunder, throwing just a horrendous torrent of water up. And that was the first clear indication we had just how dangerous the strait could be.
5 days later, on July 10th, Trentonian had been refurbished and was adorned with a new paint job featuring a large dark wave stretching back from the bow to the forecastle. They moved out of the basin and secured to a buoy in the harbour of Sheerness.
I took the opportunity to write Miss Farley in Trenton. Earlier that morning, a package had arrived with her handwriting across the label. Inside, the men found a gramophone and a parcel of records as well from the grade 10 class. I had already allowed the men to connect the radio to 5 speakers placed around the ship. And now, the gramophone was wired through as well. I knew it would give Miss Farley a real joy to imagine the men relaxing to the records donated by the citizens of Trenton. I also informed her of my plan to broadcast music later that evening from the mast speaker, that our neighboring ships might also enjoy some music. With much thanks, I also asked that she please tell the students how greatly the crew appreciated the records.
For the next 2.5 weeks, Trentonian would make numerous crossings of the channel, although there was certainly some monotony in these escorts. The threat of danger was constant. On more than one occasion, an ASDIC operator would make a contact in the water, and a depth charge was dropped on the point of contact. But the threats didn't end at the surface.
One night we found ourselves directly below point where British shore batteries were intercepting V1s. An order went out to the crew that no one was allowed on deck without their helmet. And of course that had nearly everyone grabbing their lids and hitting the stairs.
A lot of the men were on the deck when the English shore battery came streaking within 50 feet of the funnel. It was shrieking like a banshee. It exploded in the sea about 50 yards from the port beam. A huge plume of water came blasting within the air. The men opted not to stick around, and the deck was practically clear before the shell even exploded. You never forget the sound of something that deadly, that close to you, and you sure don't stick around if you don't have to.
On July 30th at 13:55, Trentonian once again departed Sheerness for Southend, and from there made the 1-hour crossing to France with mulberries in tow. On this crossing, the ship was fired on by German rail guns on the occupied French coast, and Trentonian laid a smoke screen to shield the convoy. The stokers, like Coates and Keir, worked down in the engine room. Gibbons and the other ASDIC operators listened intently to the sea. Taft and his men prepared the meals. The ship ran with the smoothness and efficiency that only repetition and experience could bring. The final orders during this period found Trentonian arriving in Milford Haven at 16:45 on August 8, 1944. This would be their new base of operations as part of the 41st Escort Group, and mark the end of Trentonian's involvement in the invasion period. Over the previous 8 weeks, Trentonian and her crew had escorted more than 22 convoys and had worked through extensive periods of continuous activity, earning Trentonian the battle honour Normandy 1944.
The first convoys were in support of the invasion force, so they were large and carried as much material as possible to coordinate the landing with as much force as possible. What was needed now were smaller convoys to provide a steady stream of supplies to the battlefield. Our role also changed. Our prime directive was getting our convoys to their destinations. If a U-boat was discovered, we were to protect the convoy while destroyers and frigates would move in to hunt the sub.
After 2 days' rest, Trentonian sailed from Milford Haven with 37 merchant ships and 2 familiar escorts, Moose Jaw, a corvette that Trentonian had worked with extensively, and Lunenburg, Lieutenant Harrison's old assignment.
I had just left the deck where I'd been taking photos. The mess bell rang and men gathered to have supper. And boy, was there ever a lot of chatter. Apparently, a Canadian escort group had sunken 2 U-boats. And there was bad news too. A minesweeper, Alberni, was torpedoed while working along the Normandy approach channels. Their call to dinner had just rang, so most of the men were below deck in the messes. The ship sunk in 20 seconds, and 59 men went with her. I could hardly believe it. 20 seconds? Just 20 seconds and they were gone.
The ship was rarely at dock, but tied up alongside 2 other vessels, so the 3 were triple parked. Harrison allowed for shore leave. This inspired those who were granted leave to bring something back for the men whom they knew would not be permitted leave before new orders were given. They liberated a keg from a local pub and rolled it back to the ships in broad daylight. The noise was heard across the docks, and men from both ships tied between Trentonian and the dock workers assisted in rolling the keg out to Trentonian's deck.
What a racket they made. Then someone came out with a fire axe. They took one swipe at the keg, and it was then they realized they should have let it settle. The air was filled with a spray of beer foam as high as a spout from a depth charge. Men grabbed anything they could to hold some suds. Most everyone got some, although no one got much.
For weeks on end, the men of Trentonian had worked like the gears of a well-oiled machine. The Aztec operators swept the water, underwater ears tuned into every acoustic signal in an attempt to find a submarine needle in a vast ocean haystack. Mission after mission occurred without incident. Naval Command would assign them an escort, they'd deliver the convoy and receive new orders. Then a day or 2 in Milford Haven, and then hoist anchor, do it all again.
Of course, I knew the men wanted to get ashore in France, and with our next escort mission scheduled for the following day, there was opportunity. I allowed half the crew in the morning for 4 hours, and the other half 4 hours in the afternoon. I set down very specific instructions. No one was to purchase or accept any wine or spirits from anyone. Cafes were to be avoided, and the men would travel in large groups at all times.
Not only was there some concern that enemy soldiers could still be in operation, as Cherbourg had been occupied by the Germans, but French sympathizers had been rumored to be poisoning the alcohol of Allied soldiers. Lieutenant Harrison also ordered Stoker Norman Sharp and several other ratings who had initially begun the war in service of the Canadian Army to run shore patrol. They were given rifles and instructions to keep an eye on their shipmates.
I was excited to get some photos of Cherbourg. I took quite a few of the destruction, the empty streets, the cathedral, and some German POWs. That was the first time we'd actually seen the enemy in the flesh. A truck of prisoners drove past us. It was eerie. Their faces were blank. They looked exhausted. They looked like us.
After their first French shore leave, early next morning, Trentonian returned to her home port in Milford Haven. Convoys remained small but regular, often consisting of just one corvette as escort, and the ship was assigned to a familiar duty, transporting the large cement caissons known as Phoenixes. Only this trip would prove very different from all the rest.
Oh, Phoenix 194. I'll never forget that ordeal. We just survived a small storm and had to leave harbor due to the weather, but little did we know what the Atlantic was brewing up for us.
The ship left harbor on October 15th, escorting 2 tugs, Saucy and Hesperia, both towing a Phoenix, number 194. Each Phoenix also carried a few men atop them, with a tent for a shelter. By shortly after midnight on October 17th, sea conditions had deteriorated so significantly, they had to seek shelter. Harrison ordered the convoy to the leeward side of Lundy Island, but many other ships had sheltered there, and Hesperia was forced to anchor away from the others. As Saucy's tow line was too long for the harbour, they cast off and made for shelter. Hesperia remained out of the wind's shadow, which caused the vessel to get caught up in their own tow line as the tide came in, swinging the giant caisson around the tug. Hesperia was forced to draw anchor and drift while getting their tow line untangled. By morning, Hesperia and Phoenix 194 were 12 miles from the island and the rest of the convoy, and the storm had worsened. Waves were 30 feet high with winds of 60 miles per hour. By the time Saucy had caught up to assist Hesperia, they couldn't attach their own tow line. Waves were breaking halfway up the forward side of the concrete caisson, making the operation impossible.
I have never had so much difficulty at sea. That caisson and those winds were hell. It was a dangerous operation as men connected tow lines in whipping wind and spray. A line would get attached, we'd move at a snail's distance, and the line would part again. As the weather once again deteriorated, I ordered the men off the Phoenix. With skillful and courageous ship handling, they had endeavored to secure the caisson over 38 hours of the most horrendous conditions, with nothing but a tent to protect them. Their work was done.
Trentonians steamed west to meet the Dutch tug Hudson, which had been sent out with extra tow lines and extra crew to man the caisson. And by late afternoon of October 19th, the convoy was once again bound for the French coast. Their success was short-lived. The caisson began to list at 15 degrees. The Trentonians' whaler was sent to retrieve the crew manning the Phoenix. Lines were cut, and the concrete caisson sank to the bottom of the sea. Although the Phoenix was lost, Rear Admiral Fairbairn commended Harrison for the manner in which he carried out his arduous duty to carry on the escort in circumstances of very considerable difficulty. October 27th at 12:55, a messenger boarded upon arrival to inform them that Admiral Fairbairn would be conducting an inspection that afternoon.
Well, that was it. The order went out and the men jumped to make ready for inspection. We didn't have long and there was plenty to do. The last 2 weeks had been very busy, very stressful, and what with the storm we were in, a little disarray. Men scrubbed the ship and themselves. Razors were broken out and shirts were ironed.
I was really proud of the crew. Their courage, their work ethic, their professionalism. The ratings really came together. The ship looked great.
The Admiral and his men made their way around the ship, inspecting the vessel and speaking with the men. Upon completion of the inspection, Fairbairn and Harrison retired to the lieutenant's cabin, where the Admiral once again praised Harrison and the crew for the extreme efforts undertaken with the Phoenix. Then the Admiral's party made their way back to the rail. After the success of the inspection and the praise given by the Admiral, Harrison ordered the spirit locker opened and 2 beers handed out to each man.
I was lucky enough to meet Admiral Fairbairn during the inspection and asked his permission for a photograph. He was more than happy to pose for me. I also took the opportunity to take photographs of the crew in our number 1s. We didn't wear them except for shore leave, which meant we were never all dressed up at the same time. So it was a rare chance to capture the whole crew looking our best.
Lieutenant Harrison wrote a letter to Hazel Farley, filling her in on the latest news and wishing her and the citizens of Trenton a happy Christmas.
Every time I received a letter from Lieutenant Harrison, I was overjoyed. News of our boys. The people of Trenton had done so much for the crew, and those boys were on our minds all the time, but even more so as Christmas Day approached. Of course, I shared it with the volunteers, filling them in on the news. With my last letter, I had included a list of things en route from us all here in Trenton. And Lieutenant Harrison told us again we were spoiling them. which always made me smile. He did mention the weather had been a bit miserable and how much the crew appreciated our magazines. And he wished us all a very Merry Christmas.
Over the next month, Trentonian would perform numerous escorts across the Channel and survived another storm that sunk an Allied trawler, Transvaal, which lost 19 crew members. Also during this time, the corvette Shawinigan was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank. There were no survivors in her crew of 91. Trentonian was stationed in Milford Haven. These escorts would travel around the southern spur of the English coast, between the Bristol Channel all the way through the Strait of Dover to the Thames estuary at London. One might think this was safer than a channel crossing, but the area was still incredibly dangerous. Enemy E-boats, aircraft, and of course German submarines were still active in the area. Coastal travel also presented its own challenges to the ASDIC operators.
Oh, it was like nothing out in the Channel, where you'd go for a while without hearing a thing. But the coast pinged out false positives everywhere. Wrecks on the seafloor, rock spurs coming off the bottom, shifting layers of water temperature. Luckily, we had a load of experience dealing with false pings. It really kept us operators on our ears, so to speak.
On December 16th, several parcels had arrived for the ship, including one very large crate.
We could hardly believe it as they lugged the crate up onto the deck. The men crowded around to see. Harrison was there too, the wry smile on his face. I think he knew. As the lid was pried off the crate, I heard a cheer go up from the men around.
It was the clothes washing machine. You should have seen the shipping manifest. The damn thing had left Canada long before, and then spent many months following behind us to ports all along the coast where we had been stationed. Guess it finally caught up.
The washing machine had finally arrived just in time for Christmas, and was installed and immediately put to use by the crew. However, not everyone took advantage.
It was a neat thing, all right, and the people of Trenton were really so very good to us. But you know something? That milk can work better, and a few of us kept on using that.
The citizens of Trenton had also included gifts for the men for the holiday, chocolate, writing kits, and things like wallets. Harrison sent a cable to Trenton on December 20th, stating, "Merry Christmas and Happy New Year from the ship's company." Red Cross parcels also arrived at this time, one for each crew member. These held various foodstuffs. Trentonian received orders to sail for the Thames with a convoy on December 21st. The trip, taking about 5 days, meant the crew would be spending Christmas Day at sea. They resigned themselves to the task at hand. But as the convoy rounded Land's End on the southern coast, new orders were given to detach from the convoy and return to Bristol Channel alongside Moose Jaw, escorting another group back to Bristol.
That made a lot of the men happy. It meant we would be in our home port for Christmas Day.
Trentonian and Moose Jaw sailed into the Bristol Channel, discharged their convoy, and anchored in Milford Haven at 04:45 on December 24th, whereupon the men began to ready the ship for the holiday. Everything they could find to give the ship a sense of festivities was hung in the messes as decoration. Later that day, Harrison received orders to sail for another convoy, but according to the crew, the skipper refused, stating that his men were going to have a Christmas holiday.
The messes were where everybody gabbed about everything, kind of like a kitchen is back home, always filled with talk, rumors, news. Sometimes it was thick as Navy gravy in there. Well, the talk Christmas Eve was all about how Harrison refused the order to sail out, how he made a stand for the crew in the face of command. Whether it was true or not, didn't seem to matter.
The men seem to think that Harrison refused a direct order. I doubt that very much, that's what happened. Although I wouldn't put it past them to negotiate for an additional day off.
No matter the details, Trentonian was allowed to remain in harbour for Christmas Day. The celebration was cut short, however, when Harrison once again received orders to lift anchor. At 23:40, Trentonian left the harbour at speed.
Orders were received in the engine room around 10:30 to leave the harbor at full speed, which isn't normal procedure, but stokers followed orders. We churned up a lot of water as we left.
Other escorts had been in harbour longer than Trentonian, and Harrison showed his displeasure at forcing his men back to work before them by rocking a number of sailors awake in those vessels. Trentonian picked up their next convoy at Barry Roads at 06:30 on December 26th, arriving back on January the 2nd without incident. Boiler cleaning commenced again, and the men enjoyed another extended shore leave. At this time, Harrison caught himself up on paperwork and also contacted Hazel Farley again.
I decided it would be a good time to take stock of all that Miss Farley and the citizens of Trenton had sent us. It was a formidable list. I was also aware that we were very well looked after, and many other adopted vessels had received quite a splash initially, and then interest had died off. We were still regular recipients of the generosity of the citizens of Trenton, and they needed to hear our appreciation.
When I read the list included in Lieutenant Harrison's letter, I couldn't believe how much we had actually sent along. 80 wallets, 75 woolen socks, 80 writing kits, mittens, records, 32,000 cigarettes.
A short mission to aid a merchant ship that had caught fire was completed successfully, and the damaged vessel was towed to harbour. On January 21st, Trentonian departed Milford Haven for Sheerness with a convoy of 14 ships. On arriving in Sheerness 3 days later, a communication was waiting for Lieutenant Harrison. News of the contents of the message travelled quickly through the ship, causing pride and sadness both. For Lieutenant Harrison had been promoted to Lieutenant Commander, but this also brought a new assignment, also effective immediately. He was to depart Trentonian and take command of HMCS Joliet, a river-class frigate, upon return to Milford Haven. Of course, this necessitated a final letter from Lieutenant Harrison to Miss Farley.
It was exceedingly difficult to write that final letter. Since first meeting Miss Farley in Trenton, I considered her a friend. She had gone to such lengths to attend to us and drum up the support of the community for the crew.
I read that letter with some regret that our official connection was broken. But as war so often does, relationships are made and broken by necessity. I replied with the full support of the community of Trenton and wishing him all the best aboard Joliet.
Most of the crew of Joliet spoke French, and Harrison signed off his final letter to Trenton's favourite French teacher with the line, "Au revoir," just to get into practice. The respect the crew felt for their skipper was immense. Harrison had been there for their training, the first Atlantic convoys, the dangers off Normandy, the friendly fire attack where he positioned the ship to save the lives of the cable crew from the Americans, the German buzz bombs. He had always fought for the crew and been light on punishment when necessary. They felt an immense loyalty to him, and he had made every effort to keep his original crew. Giving temporary command to Lieutenant Kinsman, Harrison walked across the deck for the last time. As he was piped down the gangway, the men who had gathered along the rail to say goodbye began to cheer. Harrison saluted them all before taking his last step and debarking Trentonian for the very last time, departed from our story.
I gave Harrison some photos before he left. Everyone was on deck for his departure. We'd all grown to love him like a father, even though he wasn't all that older than us. Some of the men even wiped at their eyes. I have to admit, the ship felt different after he left. But maybe it wasn't the same.
Lieutenant Colin S. Glasgow, Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve, arrived on January 31st to take over his new command of Trentonian. Glasgow had been stationed aboard Ville de Quebec since July 1943. February 1st found the crew grumbling as the order came down to make ready to leave as they donned their life jackets. Under heavy fog, Trentonian slipped away from Milford Haven under her new command, leading Convoy Btc 56, and returned to Milford Haven bearing another convoy alongside HMCS Moose Jaw. There was a meeting held on the morning of February 21st at the FOIC in Milford Haven. Lieutenant Glasgow and the skipper of Moose Jaw were informed that an escort was needed that only required one ship. Both men offered their vessel for the mission, and after some friendly debate, it was decided that a coin toss would determine which ship performed the escort. Glasgow won that toss, and so returned to Trentonian to order men to stations to get underway.
There weren't many of us that liked that story. I don't know who brought it back to the ship, but, well, we'd been here all along and had nothing to prove. So our commander wanted to stand out, maybe? I don't know. But really? A coin toss?
Bad. You don't do that in these situations. A coin toss? It's like thumbing your nose at fate.
I have to admit, it did give a bunch of us an uneasy feeling. Lieutenant Harrison wouldn't have done that, I'm sure of it.
Trentonian departed Milford Haven and joined her charges at 17:30 in the Bristol Channel on February 21st. Convoy Btc 76 was composed of 12 small coastal trawlers and 2 large Liberty ships, arranged in 2 columns with the Liberty ships in the lead. Travelling at a speed of 7 knots, the convoy left for Antwerp with Trentonian screening the columns ahead of them. Bad omens were left behind as the men began to imagine themselves in port in Belgium. The channel was clear and calm, and visibility was perfect on the day it all ended. Radar sat on standby as the ASDIC operators performed a sweep of the sea. Trentonian led the convoy, tracking its familiar zigzag motion at the front of the column. The afternoon watch had just taken their stations with lunch in their bellies. The forenoon watch had just finished their midday meal and were relaxing below deck. Gordon Gibbons was in the communication mess.
I had just laid out on one of the benches in the mess when I felt it. The whole ship rumbled as a shockwave ran through the water, and it was close.
U-boat 1004 was a Type VIIC 41 U-boat, built for Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine for service during World War II. Part of the 11th Flotilla, it operated mainly in the North Sea and against the Russian convoys in the Arctic Sea. Trentonian's convoy was sailing directly through its southern waters. The German communication officers would have heard the convoy from miles away. At 13:20, under a clear sky, a massive explosion shredded the calm of the afternoon. The SS Alexander Kennedy. Flames and fragments flew through the air. She had been torpedoed. Lieutenant Abbott had just taken command of the afternoon watch. He immediately ordered all watertight doors sealed and called the men to action stations. As he ordered Trentonian turn to port to come around the side of the convoy, Lieutenant Glasgow arrived on the bridge, took a report from Abbott, and resumed the lieutenant's actions, continuing the turn to port. Glasgow sent a message to the next vessel in the column, the Walter Christensen, asking on which side the Kennedy had been struck. The message returned starboard. Trentonian cut their turn to cross through the convoy from port to starboard in an attempt to find the contact with ASDIC. Glasgow ordered a depth charge ready as Trentonian passed through the column at full speed, but they had just cleared the convoy as the clock struck 13:30 and a second torpedo found its mark. Just minutes before that second strike, an operator within the U-boat might have heard the whine of Trentonian's engines as she made her turn and sped through the column. The commander might also have recognized this as an escort ship to the attack. Another torpedo was immediately ready, like a Zaunkönig, called a NAT by the British, short for the German Navy Acoustic Torpedo. These underwater weapons had a range of 5,000 meters and were fired from a distance of at least 400 meters, whereupon an acoustic sensor inside the device would target in on the loudest noise in the water, which on this day meant a Royal Navy corvette traveling at full speed. A steel door opened, flushing a tube with cold seawater, and seconds later the underwater missile was loosed into the sea. Zipping along unseen below the waves at 44 kilometers an hour, it honed in on Trentonian and, slicing through the water, following the churning sound of the prop, made contact and detonated. The whole corvette shuddered as water sprayed and torn steel flew into the air. Trentonian immediately listed to starboard. Fragments and shards of metal rained down all over the deck and bridge. The engines began to race. The propeller had been blown off, and the mangled remains of the screw began spinning at high speed, sending a terrible vibration through the ship. Damage to the rear of the vessel was horrendous. The aft guns were completely missing. The entire decking had been lifted by the explosion beneath it, and twisted metal and debris lay all about the starboard side. Men had been thrown and tossed by the blast. Many lay dazed among the wreckage or stumbled on the tilted decking. One sailor had been killed instantly, another decapitated by the blast. One man was missing his arm, another femur had torn through his pants above his knee. Another found himself unharmed but trapped inside the ruined metal of the quarterdeck. Some men had been thrown into the water. The ones who were conscious were thankful to have been wearing their life jackets. Lieutenant Stephen, who had been standing near where the torpedo struck, was now in the water, unconscious, with blood streaming from his head. On the bridge, Glasgow immediately ordered full stop, and Engineer Hindle in the engine room shut it down and ordered an evacuation. Sidney Coates was on duty at the time.
There were 3 of us in the engine room. I yelled, "We're sinking, get out!" And we rushed for the ladder. At the top I saw through the porthole that the deck was already submerged, the ship tilting. We heaved at the door handle, terrified it would break, and we'd drown. But it opened, and water rushed past us as we made the deck.
Men moved the wounded to the rails while another crawls through the wreckage on deck to disarm the depth charges. If even one of them was missed, they would explode as the ship sank, potentially killing anyone in the water. Engineer Hindle took stock of the damage. The entire aft of the ship was in ruins and taking on water quickly. Lieutenant Glasgow gave the order to abandon ship at 13:34, just 4 minutes after the torpedo had slammed into Trentonian. This set the crew into motion, acting on training they had first acquired in Bermuda, but perfected in trials since. Lieutenant Abbott grabbed code books and charts and locked them away. Some were affixed to weights and immediately sunk. Others were burned on deck. Wounded men were placed in the whaler. Those that couldn't be moved easily had life jackets affixed and were left. They attempted to save the armless sailor by placing him in a life jacket. But as he entered the water, he slipped out and vanished beneath the waves. On the quarterdeck, men had been desperately trying to free their shipmate from his prison of twisted metal. But as the water swirled around his terrified eyes and finally covered his head, choking off his screams for help, they had to leave him and swam off the sunken deck into the ocean.
I couldn't release the line from one of the Carly floats. I didn't have my life jacket on, having just run up from the boiler room. I was about to give up and jump in when one of the gunners ran by and tossed me one. Figures though, I jumped in the water and the float came down, just missing me.
I remember foolishly now, taking off my sea boots and placing them under an ammunition locker. I thought I might be able to retrieve them later. Then I jumped the rail. By God, it was a cold shock when I went under.
The ship rapidly took on water, the nose continuing to climb into the air. As men were swimming off the deck at the rear of the ships, those at the nose had to jump.
I was in a Carly float, soaked to the bone, but otherwise okay. Trentonian continued to list. I saw Lieutenant Dodds make his way up the rail of the forward gun deck. Pause. Look out over the waves, and would you believe it? He did a swan dive into the sea.
The whaler was gained by Lieutenant Kinsman, who released it from the starboard side in a hurry to clear the rapidly sinking ship, while Lieutenant Glasgow and Lieutenant Abbott, having taken one last check of the area for survivors, climbed down from the bridge and simply stepped off into the frigid waters of the English Channel, the last men to leave Trentonian. As the ship's nose rose above the men bobbing in the water, and the floats, a crash accentuated by the tinkle of piano keys was followed by the pennant numbers K368, slowly slipping below the waves in a vast swirl of water and bubbles. 10 short minutes after the torpedo strike at 1340, on February 22, 1945, Her Majesty's Canadian ship Trentonian had sunk. 15 months of a grueling routine of service and 6 young lives lost, all terribly finished in 10 short minutes of total destruction. Although hypothermia had begun to affect the survivors, the convoy had to carry on. Rescue had already begun in earnest as vessels were directed to the vicinity. Royal Navy motor launches ML-600 and ML-124 high-speed attack vessels used in harbour defence arrived in 20 minutes and started taking on survivors. A head count was completed noting the lost men. Of the 95 survivors, 11 of the injured were immediately taken by ambulance to Falmouth sick quarters as soon as they docked, while 2 sailors with more serious injuries were admitted at the Royal Cornwall Infirmary in Truro. A search for the U-boat was almost immediately launched. However, a full day and a half after the attack, with only one potential contact, it was called off. The Germans had escaped. The uninjured men attended a joint burial service for Lieutenant Stephen and memorial for the missing men, even though each lost sailor could be accounted for in the attack. Without bodily evidence, they were officially classified as missing. Later that day, as Lieutenant Glasgow temporarily delayed the mountain of paperwork to write letters to the families of the dead and missing, the crew left Falmouth by train for Niobe, Scotland. They had been granted survivor's leave and were being returned to Canada by ship on March 8th. But not before a chance encounter in Niobe saved a rich historical record of the lost corvette Trentonian.
We were all excited to get back to Canada and see our families and friends and forget about the war for a while, if we could. But there was so much lost too, not just our crewmates and our friends or the ship we called home for over a year, but all of our possessions. My photos, hundreds of my negatives went down with the ship.
The crew was definitely ready to go home. We were wearing ill-fitted clothes and we had nothing to our name except for some survivor pay that was handed out as we left Falmouth.
What a fluke. I ran into a stoker that had been reassigned off Trentonian just 2 weeks before the attack, and he'd been with us since Quebec City. He was completely shocked when I told him the news. Well, doesn't it turn out he mentions he's broke, needs some cash, and didn't he just have the best thing possible to sell to me? Almost 200 of Singleton's photos!
When Bruce came in with that bundle, I was stunned. I couldn't believe my luck. That's when I realized there were many more photographs out there, because I had sold and given so many to crewmates who had left the ship.
An official board of inquiry was called in Plymouth. They found the crew had acted appropriately and that the circumstances leading to the sinking of Trentonian required no disciplinary action. On March 15th, the able-bodied survivors of the HMCS Trentonian landed in Halifax, where some of the men lived. The rest began to disperse back across the country by train, eager to see family and begin their survivor's leave.
There were heartfelt goodbyes all along our route. Men get off in New Brunswick and Quebec, and before the last stop in Toronto, there weren't many of us left. It was so real. All these friends, almost like family members, and all of it was over. I boarded a train for Saskatoon and waved to the last of the men on the platform. As much as I was looking forward to home, I was also sad. I was going to miss those guys.
News of Trentonians' loss was released on March 26, 1945. Mayor Corey, Hazel Farley, and the people of Trenton learned the fate of their ship at the same time as the rest of Canada through the official press release. Mayor Corey ordered the flags of Trenton lowered to half-mast to honor the men who had been killed in the attack.
Oh, it was terrible news. We had gotten to know them through our letters, a lot of us, and the kids at the high school. It was something you always knew could happen, but didn't ever think about. And then all I could think about was those 6 poor boys and the sacrifice they had made for all of us. Our 6 lost boys.
On the morning of March 28, 1945, Mayor H.R. Corey sat down at his desk at Trenton City Hall, holding his first order of business of the day, a letter. He knew what news he was holding. All of Trenton knew by now, but though he hesitated, he opened the envelope addressed to him from the Department of National Defense for Naval Services. He read the official news and the final paragraph. The department takes this opportunity to express its sincere thanks for the kindness and generosity of the good people of Trenton in providing for the comfort and welfare of the crew of this corvette. Mayor Corey set the letter down on his desk and walked across the room. He looked out the windows at the city of Trenton, out past where the flag at half-mast riffled in a strong spring breeze. In Europe, the war was approaching the end. In the English Channel, a corvette lay ruined on the seabed. But here in Trenton, Ontario, Canada, the spirit of the community and the legacy of a ship named after it remained unsinkable.